The air inside the Scott County Courthouse felt heavy, thick with the smell of floor wax and old, dusty transcripts that had seen too many lives fall apart. David sat at the scarred oak table, his hands calloused from 25 years of fixing, burst pipes and broken machinery at the city hospital trembling in a way they never did when he was holding a wrench. Beside him, his lawyer, a man whose tie was perpetually crooked and whose eyes carried the fatigue of 1,000 failed mediations, slid a stack of legal documents across the wood. The sound of the paper sliding felt like a final warning. The lawyer leaned in, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely rose above the hum of the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. He didn't sugarcoat it. He told David that if the judge leaned even slightly toward biological rights, they were in danger of losing everything. David felt the blood drain from his face, a cold, hollow sensation settling in his chest. For over a decade, he had been the one to wake up for the nightmares, the one to navigate the complex world of sensory overloads, and the one to provide a steady home. Yet here in this room, none of that seemed to carry the weight of a DNA strand. Across the table, Ethan didn't flinch. At 17, he had grown tall and lanky, with a habit of hunching his shoulders as if trying to shield himself from a world that was always a few decibels too loud for his comfort. His eyes remained fixed on a small notch in the wooden table, their calm gray-blue hue reminiscent of the quiet mornings they spent together. Before the rest of the city woke up, he reached out and touched David's arm, his fingers barely grazing the sleeve of his flannel shirt, and leaned in close. David could smell the familiar scent of peppermint gum, Ethan's constant companion, when his mind was racing through lines of code or complex patterns. "Just let her talk," Ethan whispered, the words so soft they were almost lost to the buzzing lights above. David looked at him, confused and desperate. He wanted to scream that talking was the very thing that had allowed Sienna to weave a web of excuses 11 years ago. He wanted to remind the room that talking was how she had justified walking out the door and never looking back. But Ethan's gaze was steady, like a stone sitting at the bottom of a rushing river. Unmoved by the current. The lawyer exhaled a long, tired breath and rubbed his forehead, the lines of his face deepening under the harsh light. He explained that family court was an unpredictable beast, a place where logic often took a back seat to ancient laws and biological technicalities. He warned David that Sienna's legal team was going to paint a picture of a controlling stepfather who had alienated a grieving mother from her child, a man sitting on a fortune that rightfully belonged to the woman who gave birth to the genius. Behind it, David's stomach turned at the thought of Sienna's face, the perfectly applied makeup, the practiced tremble in her lower lip, and that calculated way she used silence to make others feel guilty. He remembered the last time she had stood on his porch, draped in an expensive coat that cost more than his monthly mortgage, claiming she just wanted her son back. It was a performance, a hollow script written by someone who viewed motherhood as a lost accessory rather than a lifelong commitment. As the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, David realized that the quiet battle Ethan was fighting was far more sophisticated than the one he had prepared for. He had spent 11 years learning the rhythms of Ethan's world, the way he needed his socks folded, the way loud grocery stores made his breath hitch, and the way he found peace in the logic of a computer screen. David had stayed because that's what fathers do, even when they don't share the same blood. But as he looked at the stack of folders Ethan had brought with him, meticulously organized and labeled in his precise handwriting, David felt a shift in the atmosphere. He had been ready to fight with his fists and his heart, but Ethan was preparing to fight with the only thing that could truly dismantle a lie, the cold, hard data of a life lived in the shadows of abandonment. The judge was about to enter, and the worst moment of David's life was about to begin. But Ethan's calm was a shield, a silent promise that the truth was patient, and it was finally time for the world to listen. To truly understand why David was sitting in a courtroom with his heart in his throat, you have to go back 11 years to a night in Portland that felt like the end of the world. It was late October, and the city was drowning under a relentless, freezing downpour that turned the Willamette River into a churning, dark monster. The wind howled through the Douglas firs, stripping them of their last autumn leaves and plastering them against the windows of their small, cramped house on the edge of the city. David remembered that night with a clarity that stung. He had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift at the hospital, his back aching from hauling heavy oxygen tanks, and his hands smelling of industrial bleach and rusted iron. His boots were soaked through, squeaking on the old linoleum floor as he stepped into the kitchen, expecting the usual quiet chaos of a family evening. Instead, he found a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. The kitchen was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single overhead bulb that hummed with a low-frequency buzz. Ethan, only 6 years old at the time, was sitting at the wooden table, his small frame looking even tinier in the oversized chair. He wasn't eating. He was rocking back and forth with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, his eyes locked onto the floral pattern of the tablecloth, as if he were trying to decode a secret message hidden in the fabric. David's heart sank. He knew that rocking, it was Ethan's way of anchoring himself when the world became too loud or too confusing. Then, David saw a large, designer suitcase standing by the back door, its leather handle gleaming under the light like a predator waiting in the shadows. Sienna stood by the counter, her back to him, her fingers nervously twisting the strap of her handbag. She didn't look like a mother who had been home all day. Her hair was perfectly curled. Her makeup was flawless, and she wore a coat that looked far too thin for the Oregon winter, but far too expensive for their modest life. Sienna, David's voice was a raspy whisper, the exhaustion of the day suddenly replaced by a sharp, cold dread. She didn't turn around immediately. She kept staring at the sink, watching the water run over a single plate she wasn't even washing. When she finally faced him, there was no sadness in her eyes, only a cold, hard resolve that made David feel like a stranger in his own home. She told him she couldn't do it anymore, not the house, not the bills, and especially not the burden of a child who didn't speak the way other children did. David laughed, a short, bitter sound born of pure disbelief. He asked if she was joking, if this was just a reaction to the stress of the recent doctor's appointments. But Sienna's jaw was set. She spoke about the walls closing in on her, about how she was too young to be trapped in a life of therapy sessions, special diets, and the constant, draining silence of a son who looked through her rather than at her. The argument that followed was a blur of whispered insults and desperate pleas, all while Ethan sat inches away, his rocking growing faster, his breathing becoming short and jagged. David tried to remind her that they had just received the official diagnosis, that Ethan needed them now more than ever, but Sienna snapped back, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. She claimed she hadn't signed up for this version of motherhood. She looked at Ethan not with love, but with a terrifying kind of detachment, as if he were a piece of furniture that no longer fit the aesthetic of her life. Through the kitchen window, David saw the glare of headlights idling in the rain-slicked alleyway behind their fence. A car was waiting. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. She hadn't just decided to leave. She had planned it. She had waited for him to come home, just to hand over the responsibility like a baton in a race. She was tired of running. As she grabbed her suitcase, the sound of the wheels clicking against the floor tiles echoed like a countdown. She didn't offer a long goodbye. She walked over to Ethan and kissed the top of his head, a hollow, performative gesture that lacked any real warmth, and then she was gone. The door clicked shut, allowing a brief, violent gust of cold, wet air to invade the kitchen before the silence returned, deeper and more suffocating than before. David stood frozen, his wet boots leaving puddles on the floor, staring at the closed door. He felt completely unqualified, a man who could fix a boiler or a hospital bed, but had no idea how to mend a shattered 6-year-old's world. He looked down at his hands, raw and red from work, and wondered how he was supposed to be enough. But then, Ethan stopped rocking. He looked up at David, his eyes wide and searching, and whispered a single word, "Mom." The pain in that one word was enough to snap David out of his shock. He sat down in the cold vinyl chair, took Ethan's small, shaking hand in his own, and made a silent vow to the empty room. He didn't know how to be a mother, and he didn't know how to fix a broken heart, but he knew how to stay. The weeks following Sienna's departure were a slow-motion blur of gray Portland mornings and late-night research sessions that left David's eyes burning. He felt like a man trying to read a map in a language he didn't speak. The house felt cavernous without Sienna's perfume and the constant hum of her restlessness. But the silence that replaced it was far more demanding. David had to learn a new way of living, a new way of breathing. He began carrying a small notebook in the pocket of his work khakis, jotting down Ethan's triggers like he was documenting a temperamental piece of hospital machinery. Fluorescent lights at the grocery store, level for distress, the texture of mashed potatoes, total shutdown. The sound of the garbage truck on Thursday mornings requires heavy blankets and noise-canceling headphones. The formal diagnosis of autism hadn't been a surprise, but seeing the word printed on official clinical letterhead made it feel heavy, like a permanent seal on Ethan's future. David remembered, sitting in the specialist's office, the air smelling of lavender oil and expensive silence. The doctor had talked about spectrums, sensory processing, and social milestones. But all David could see was his son's small hand tracing the edge of the mahogany desk over and over again. He realized then that he wasn't just Ethan's guardian, he had to become his translator. He had to bridge the gap between a world that was too loud and a boy who was too sensitive. He spent his lunch breaks at the hospital, sitting in the basement maintenance closet, reading borrowed books on neurodiversity until the words swam before his eyes. Money, or the lack of it, became a constant, gnawing predator at their door. Raising a child with special needs in a city like Portland was an expensive endeavor. There were co-pays for speech therapy, specialized occupational tools, and the sheer cost of sensory-friendly clothing that didn't make Ethan feel like his skin was on fire. David took every overtime shift available at the hospital. He became the man who worked every holiday, every double shift, and every emergency call out. He would come home at 3 a.m., his joints stiff and his soul weary, only to find Ethan awake, sitting in the dark kitchen, staring at the digital clock on the stove. It's 3:04. Ethan would say, his voice flat, 3:04 is a prime number. David would just nod, pull up a chair, and sit with him until the sun began to bleed through the Oregon mist. It was during these quiet, desperate years that the first seeds of symmetry were planted. It started with a broken laptop David had scavenged from the hospital's electronic waste bin. It was a clunky, battered thing with a flickering screen. But to 7-year-old Ethan, it was a window into a world that finally made sense. While other kids were out playing soccer in the rain, Ethan was teaching himself the logic of code. He discovered that numbers didn't lie, and software didn't change its mind halfway through a conversation. David watched from the doorway as Ethan spent hours organizing files, creating folders within folders, building a digital universe where everything had a place, and every action had a predictable reaction. One afternoon, David found Ethan having a severe meltdown in the middle of a busy department store. The bright lights, the overlapping voices, and the smell of artificial cinnamon had overwhelmed him. Ethan was on the floor, his hands clamped over his ears, humming a single, mournful note. David had knelt beside him, shielding him from the stares of strangers, feeling a profound sense of helplessness. Later that night, back in the safety of their quiet living room, Ethan didn't cry. Instead, he grabbed a stack of graph paper and began to draw. He wasn't drawing pictures. He was drawing a flowchart. He was trying to map out a way to navigate the store, a visual guide that broke the chaos down into small, manageable steps. It's too much input, Dad, Ethan had said, his eyes finally meeting David's for a fleeting second. I need a filter. That word filter stayed with David. He realized that Ethan wasn't trying to change the world. He was trying to build a lens through which he could survive it. David decided right then that he would do whatever it took to give Ethan the tools he needed. He sold his beloved old truck, the one he'd spent years maintaining, and used the money to buy a refurbished, high-end laptop and a stack of programming manuals. He started taking the bus to work, walking miles in the rain to save on gas money. Also, Ethan could have the processing power he required. He didn't know then that he wasn't just buying a computer. He was funding a revolution. He was helping a boy who couldn't handle a grocery store build a bridge for millions of others who felt the same way. By the time Ethan reached 16, the small, flickering laptop David had bought him years ago had been replaced by a high-powered workstation, a beast of a machine that hummed constantly in the corner of his bedroom. The house on the outskirts of Portland had become a sanctuary of logic. David had learned to move through the rooms like a ghost, respecting the invisible boundaries Ethan needed to maintain his focus. The walls of Ethan's room were no longer covered in posters of superheroes. Instead, they were plastered with complex diagrams, color-coded logic gates, and handwritten lines of Python and C++. To David, it looked like a foreign language, a beautiful but incomprehensible script. To Ethan, it was a lifeline. He was no longer just a boy who struggled with the world. He was a boy who was rebuilding it, one line of code at a time. The app, which Ethan eventually named Symmetry, was born. Out of a particularly brutal winter, Portland had been hit by a series of ice storms that knocked out the power and disrupted every routine they had established. For someone like Ethan, the loss of predictability was like losing oxygen. He spent 3 days in a state of high functioning, panic, unable to eat or sleep because the rhythm of the day had been shattered. When the power finally flickered back on, he didn't go to bed. He went to his computer. He began designing an interface that didn't just schedule a day, but predicted the sensory load of every environment. It used real-time data, weather, traffic, sound levels from public sensors to create a path of least resistance for neurodivergent users. It was a GPS for the soul, a way to navigate a chaotic reality without drowning in the noise. David watched the transformation with a mixture of awe and exhaustion. He was still working double shifts at the hospital, his joints now permanently stiff from decades of physical labor, but he never complained. He became the primary beta tester for Symmetry. Ethan would have him walk through the local Fred Meyer grocery store using the app, tracking David's heart rate and the ambient decibel levels via a smartwatch. "You're too close to the deli section, Dad," Ethan would mutter, staring at the data on his screen back home. The high-pitched hum of the refrigeration units is spiking the frequency. "Take the aisle with the dry goods. It's 12% quieter." David would follow the digital instructions on his wrist, amazed at how the app turned a terrifying maze of stimuli into a manageable series of coordinates. The turning point came during a small tech symposium held at the University of Portland. David had practically dragged Ethan there, promising him that they would stay for only 20 minutes. Ethan stood in a small, cramped booth, his eyes fixed on his shoes, while David handed out crudely printed flyers to anyone who walked by. Most people glanced at the lanky teenager and moved on to the flashy AI startups with their bright banners and free pens. But then, a woman stopped. She was a director at a major tech venture firm. But more importantly, she was the mother of a nonverbal child. She watched the demo on Ethan's tablet for 5 minutes, her expression moving from curiosity to profound, tearful realization. She didn't ask about his profit margins. She asked if she could use the prototype for her daughter's walk to school. The next morning, 6 months later, the world shifted. The investor meetings David attended with Ethan were surreal. David sat in high-rise offices in downtown Portland, wearing his only suit, a charcoal gray number that was 10 years out of fashion, feeling like an imposter among the men in tailored blazers and expensive watches. They talked about scalability, user acquisition, and market disruption. Ethan, however, remained unfazed. He spoke about the app with a clinical, detached passion, explaining the math behind the sensory filters as if he were discussing the weather. When the final offer was slid across a glass conference table, evaluation of $3.7 million for a majority stake and a lead developer role for Ethan, David felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. He thought of the rusted truck he'd sold, the late-night shifts, and the years of being told that Ethan might never live an independent life. They didn't celebrate with champagne or a fancy dinner. They went to a local diner and ordered the same breakfast they had eaten every Saturday for a decade. As David watched Ethan carefully separate his hash browns from his eggs, he felt a strange, cold prickle at the back of his neck. He realized that the money wasn't just a reward for Ethan's Genius, it was a beacon. It was a loud, flashing signal that could be seen from miles away, even by those who had long ago turned their backs on them. He thought of Sienna, wondering where she was and if she still checked the news. He realized that they had spent 11 years building a fortress of privacy and peace, but wealth had a way of tearing down walls. As he reached into his pocket to pay the bill, he felt the weight of the new folder. Ethan had started a file labeled legal and assets. The war hadn't ended with the paycheck. It had only just changed fronts. The rain in Portland has a specific sound when it hits the roof of a house. That's finally found its peace. It's a rhythmic, comforting patter. But on that Tuesday evening, the rain felt different. It felt jagged, like it was trying to claw its way through the glass. David was in the kitchen, his hands stained with the grease of a lawnmower he was trying to fix, when the knock came. It wasn't the frantic tap of a neighbor, or the heavy thud of a delivery driver. It was a deliberate, sharp sound, a sound that belonged to someone who expected to be let in. When David opened the door, the cold air rushed into the hallway, carrying with it a scent he hadn't smelled in over a decade, expensive jasmine perfume and the metallic tang of the city. Sienna stood on the porch, shielded by a sleek, black umbrella. She looked like a ghost that had been polished until it shone. Her hair was a darker shade of chestnut now. Her coat was a deep charcoal wool that screamed of high-end boutiques, and her eyes the same gray-blue as Ethan's were scanning the entryway with a predatory efficiency. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the idle hum of a luxury car parked in the driveway behind her, its headlights cutting through the mist like the eyes of a deep-sea creature. "Hello, David," she said. Her voice was smooth, devoid of the jagged edges it had. The night she left, it was the voice of someone who had spent years practicing how to sound sincere. David didn't move. He felt the old anger, a dormant volcano for 11 years, begin to churn in his chest. "You're on the wrong porch, Sienna," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He didn't step back to let her in. He stood like a barricade, his large frame filling the doorway. He thought of the thousands of nights he'd spent sitting on the floor outside Ethan's room during a meltdown, and the hundreds of times he'd checked the bank account to see if they could afford both groceries and therapy. Seeing her now, draped in the spoils of a life she'd chosen over her son, made his blood run cold. Sienna didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a soft, rehearsed sigh. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be. I was young, I was scared, and I didn't have your strength, David. But I've changed." She stepped forward, an inch into his personal space, her expression softening into a mask of maternal longing. "I saw the news. About Ethan, about the app. My heart nearly stopped. I realized then that I couldn't stay away any longer. I need to see my son." "He's not your son," David snapped, the words echoing off the hallway walls. "He's the boy you dropped off like a bag of unwanted clothes. He's the person you told me you didn't sign up for. You don't get to see the masterpiece when you refused to help carry the stone." Behind David, the floorboards creaked. He didn't have to turn around to know Ethan was there. He could feel the change in the air, the way the atmosphere in the house suddenly became charged with static. Ethan was standing in the shadows of the hallway, his hands tucked into the sleeves of his hoodie, his shoulders hunched in that familiar defensive posture. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were locked on Sienna. It wasn't a look of recognition or love. It was the look of a scientist observing a specimen that didn't fit the data. Sienna's eyes bypassed David and landed on Ethan. A practiced tremble took hold of her lower lip. "Ethan, oh, look at you. You're so tall." She reached out a hand, but David stepped further into the gap, blocking her path. "The letter will explain everything," Sienna said, her tone suddenly shifting from emotional to transactional as she realized David wouldn't budge. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out a thick, ivory envelope. "I've retained legal counsel, not to hurt you, David, but to reestablish my rights. Ethan is a minor, and as his biological mother, I have a responsibility to ensure his interests are being managed correctly, especially now that his life has become so complicated." "Complicated," David whispered, his hands curling into fists. "You mean especially now that he's worth $3 million? Sienna didn't answer. She simply placed the envelope on the small table near the door, gave Ethan one last lingering, calculated look, and turned back toward the rain. As she walked away, David realized with a sinking heart that she hadn't come back for a son. She had come back for a portfolio. He closed the door and locked it, the click of the deadbolt sounding painfully final. He looked at Ethan, who was still staring at the spot where she had stood. "Dad," Ethan said, his voice flat and steady. "Yeah, buddy?" She was breathing at 18 cycles per minute, Ethan said, his mind already processing the sensory data of the encounter. "That's the rate people use when they are trying to stay calm while telling a lie. We should call the lawyer." David looked at his son, this boy who saw the world in patterns and truths, and realized that the battle for Ethan's future wasn't going to be fought with heart alone. It was going to be a war of records, and for the first time in 11 years, David felt like he was the one who was unprepared. The ivory envelope Sienna left on the table sat there for 3 days like a live grenade. David couldn't bring himself to open it until the weekend, when the house was quiet and the Oregon rain had turned into a soft, deceptive mist. When he finally broke the seal, the legal jargon felt like a physical assault. It wasn't just a request for visitation, it was a full-scale offensive. Sienna was petitioning for co-guardianship, citing irregularities in Ethan's upbringing and questioning David's ability to manage a multi-million-dollar trust as a blue-collar laborer with no financial background. Monday morning found David in the office of a lawyer named Marcus, a man who looked like he was carved out of old cedar. The office was located in a converted warehouse in Portland's Pearl District, smelling of expensive coffee and old law books. Marcus read through the petition, his brow furrowing with every page. "She's smart, David," Marcus said, leaning back in his leather chair. "She's not attacking you as a person, she's attacking your circumstances. She's painting a picture of a world where Ethan, a vulnerable neurodivergent teen, is being handled by someone who doesn't understand the complexities of high finance or the sophisticated needs of a growing tech empire." In the eyes of a conservative family court judge, a biological mother with a clean record and a sudden interest in her child's welfare can be a powerful force. David felt the familiar tightness in his throat. She wasn't there for the sophisticated needs when he was screaming for 6 hours because the neighbor mowed their lawn. She wasn't there for the vulnerable times when he didn't eat for 2 days because I changed the brand of bread by mistake. How can the law ignore 11 years of silence? Because the law likes paper, Marcus replied simply. And right now, she has a birth certificate and you have memories. We need to turn those memories into data. When they got home that evening, David found Ethan in the basement. It was the coldest part of the house, the place where Ethan went when his brain felt overheated. He had set up a folding table and was surrounded by stacks of manila folders, shoeboxes of old receipts, and 3 different hard drives. He didn't look up when David entered. "I've been indexing, Dad," Ethan said. His voice had that rhythmic, focused quality it took on when he was deep into a project. David walked over and looked at the table. Ethan had created a chronological timeline of their lives since the night Sienna left. But it wasn't just a diary, it was an audit. There were spreadsheets for every therapy session, every doctor's visit, every school IEP individualized education program meeting. Ethan had even gone back through David's old bank statements, highlighting the overtime shifts and the specific dates David had sold his truck and his tools to pay for software licenses. "What is all this, Ethan?" "It's the counter-argument," Ethan said, finally looking up. His eyes were tired but sharp. "Sienna's lawyer will argue that she was prevented from being a mother, or that she was recovering, but data doesn't have emotions. I've logged every time you tried to call her between 2014 and 2016. I found the old phone logs, 32 calls, all of them under 1 minute. Those are the calls where she hung up on you." He slid a specific folder toward David. Inside were printed transcripts of voicemails and emails. David's heart skipped a beat. He had forgotten about some of these, the cruel, short messages Sienna had sent in the early years when David had begged her for help with the bills. "Stop calling me, Gary. You wanted the house. You deal with the kid. I'm starting over." "She didn't think I was listening," Ethan whispered, his fingers twitching on the table. She thought because I didn't look at her, I didn't exist. But I was recording the patterns. I've been recording them for 11 years. David realized then that while he had been trying to shield Ethan from the pain of his mother's rejection, Ethan had been quietly documenting it. He had been building a fortress out of facts. David sat down on a dusty crate, overwhelmed by the realization that his 17-year-old son was more prepared for a courtroom battle than any high-priced lawyer. "We need to stay clean, Ethan," David warned, remembering Marcus's advice. "No lashing out, no anger, just the records." Ethan nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Data only works if it stays clean." "She's going to talk a lot, Dad. She's going to use a lot of adjectives and a lot of feelings. We just need to wait for her to run out of words." As they sat in the dim light of the basement, David felt a strange sense of calm. The fear of losing Ethan hadn't vanished, but it had been replaced by a grim resolve. They weren't just a stepfather and a son anymore. They were a team. And for the first time, David began to suspect that Sienna had no idea what kind of mind she was trying to outmaneuver. She was playing a game of emotions, but Ethan was playing a game of logic, and in Ethan's world, logic always won. The day of the hearing arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. Portland was caught in a transitional chill, the kind of damp cold that seeped into your marrow and made your joints ache. David dressed in his best charcoal suit, the one he'd bought for Ethan's high school graduation, and spent 10 minutes in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to get his tie straight. His hands, usually so steady with a pipe wrench, were fumbling like a nervous teenager's. He looked at his reflection and saw a man who had aged 20 years in the last 11. The lines around his eyes were deep trenches carved by worry and lack of sleep, but his jaw was set with a hardness that hadn't been there before. The Multnomah County Courthouse was a towering structure of stone and glass, a place where the air felt sanitized of hope. As they walked up the steps, David felt the weight of the folders in his briefcase. Ethan walked beside him, his gait stiff, his eyes fixed on the pavement. He was wearing a navy blazer and a soft cotton shirt. David had made sure the fabric was high quality so the texture wouldn't trigger a sensory shutdown. Ethan carried a slim leather laptop bag, his movements precise and deliberate. He looked less like a victim of a custody battle and more like a young executive arriving for a high-stakes merger. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of old paper and floor polish. Sienna was already there, seated at the petitioner's table. She looked like a portrait of grieving motherhood. She wore a simple, elegant navy dress, her hair pulled back in a modest bun, and no jewelry other than a thin gold watch. Her lawyer, a young man with a sharp haircut and an expensive-looking briefcase, was whispering in her ear. When David and Ethan sat down at the opposite table, Sienna turned and offered a small, sad smile, a masterpiece of artifice designed for the judge's benefit. The judge, a woman named Holloway with a reputation for being no-nonsense and strictly adherent to the best interests of the child standard, took the bench with a sharp rap of her gavel. The sound echoed in the high-ceilinged room, making Ethan flinch slightly. David reached under the table and squeezed Ethan's hand. It was cold, but the grip was firm. Sienna's lawyer opened the proceedings with a silver-tongued narrative. He spoke of a woman who had been overwhelmed by the staggering challenges of early motherhood, a woman who had suffered in silence while her son was raised by a man who, while well-intentioned, lacked the biological and emotional connection required for a child with Ethan's specific needs. He painted a picture of Sienna's recovery and her desperate yearning to be part of the life she had once felt forced to flee. He subtly emphasized the $3.7 million trust, framing it not as the reason for her return, but as a complex financial responsibility that required a mother's touch and professional oversight. Then, Sienna took the stand. She was a brilliant actress. She spoke in a soft, melodic tone, her voice cracking at just the right moments as she described the darkness of her early years. "I was a child myself," she whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I didn't understand what Ethan needed. I thought he would be better off with David while I fixed myself. I never stopped loving him. Every night, I looked at the moon and wondered if he was sleeping. David felt a hot surge of fury. He wanted to scream about the missed birthdays, the silent phone, the years of zero child support, and the way Ethan used to wait by the window until the sun went down, hoping for a car that never came. He felt himself leaning forward, his mouth opening to protest, when he felt a sharp, rhythmic tapping on his leg. It was Ethan. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ethan was tapping his own knee in a steady pattern. He leaned over and whispered, "Let her talk, Dad. The more she talks, the more she creates her own noise." Sienna continued for nearly an hour. She spoke of her new life, her stable home, and her deep research into autism. But as she talked, she began to slip. She described Ethan's favorite childhood toys that he'd never owned. She mentioned a shared love of the park that they'd only visited twice. She was building a house of cards out of pleasant-sounding lies, unaware that the person she was talking about had spent his entire life analyzing patterns for inconsistencies. David looked at the judge. Judge Holloway was listening intently, her face a mask of judicial neutrality. But her pen was moving rapidly across her notepad. Marcus, David's lawyer, sat back with his arms crossed, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He wasn't interrupting. He was giving Sienna all the rope she needed. When Sienna finally stepped down, looking exhausted but satisfied with her performance, Marcus stood up. He didn't look at Sienna. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor, the petitioner has spoken at length about her feelings and her memories. We would like to present the reality of the last 11 years, not through testimony, but through the objective record." Ethan opened his laptop. The soft hum of the machine felt like the start of a countdown. David realized that the theater of the courtroom was about to meet the reality of the data. Sienna had brought a script, but Ethan had brought the truth, and in this room, only one of them would survive the cross-examination of the facts. The silence that followed Marcus's statement was heavy, a vacuum in the room that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the air. David watched as Ethan stood up. His movements were slow and deliberate, a stark contrast to the fluid, rehearsed grace Sienna had shown on the stand. Ethan didn't look at the gallery or the lawyers. He looked only at the small screen of his laptop as he connected it to the courtroom's digital display. On the large monitor mounted on the wall, a series of folders appeared. They were labeled, with clinical precision, financial contributions, medical history, communication logs outgoing, incoming. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice cutting through the stillness like a cold wind. "Miss Sienna has testified that she remained in contact and provided support. We would like to examine the communication logs folder." Ethan clicked a button. A spreadsheet appeared on the screen. It was a terrifyingly detailed map of 11 years of silence. Every row was a date. Every column was a result. David saw the years 2014, 2015, and 2016 flash by, hundreds of rows marked in red. No answer, call rejected, number disconnected. The visual representation of her absence was staggering. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a mountain of evidence. "Miss Sienna," Marcus said, turning toward her, "you testified that you never stopped reaching out. Can you explain why? Out of the 412 attempts made by Mr. David to contact you regarding Ethan's surgeries and school placements, your response rate was exactly 0.5%. Sienna's lawyer jumped up, shouting an objection about the authenticity of the logs, but Marcus was ready. He produced a subpoenaed record from the cellular provider. The data matched Ethan's spreadsheet perfectly. Sienna sat at her table, her face losing its carefully applied color. The mask of motherhood was starting to crack. Then Ethan spoke. It was the first time his voice had filled the courtroom. It wasn't loud, but it had the steady, undeniable weight of a mountain. "On March 15, 2017, Ethan said, looking directly at the judge, at 2:30 p.m., I recorded a voicemail. I was 10 years old. I had just won a regional math competition, and Dad called her because he thought she should know." Ethan clicked a file. The sound of a phone ringing filled the room, followed by the muffled, younger voice of David saying, "Sienna, he did it. He won. He wants to talk to you." Then came Sienna's voice. It was sharp, cold, and stripped of the melody she had used today. "I told you to stop calling me, David. I'm in a meeting." I don't want this responsibility anymore. If you want to keep him, but leave me out of it. Don't call me again unless there's a real reason." The room went deathly quiet. Even the court reporter's fingers froze over the keys. Sienna's lawyer looked down at his desk, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Sienna herself looked as if she had been struck. That one recording the real reason she had waited for was now playing back, to haunt her in a room full of people she had tried to deceive. "I am not a vulnerable minor in need of professional oversight," Ethan continued, his voice never wavering. "I am a developer. I build systems based on logic, and logically. A mother is a person who stays when the environment becomes high stimulus." Sienna didn't stay. She didn't even call back to see if the surgery went well. "She is not a factor in my data set." The judge leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the screen where a final document was being displayed. It was a summary of David's financial sacrifices, the sale of the truck, the double shifts at the hospital, the constant flow of resources into Ethan's education and health. "Mr. David has a biological connection to me," Ethan said, and for the first time, his voice carried a hint of emotion, not anger, but a profound, unshakable loyalty. "He is the person who stayed in the room when the lights were too bright. He is the person who learned to speak my language when I couldn't speak his. In the world of symmetry, he is the constant. Everything else is just noise." Sienna tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound came out. The talk she had relied on the adjectives, the rehearsed grief. The excuses had been systematically dismantled by the one person she had underestimated. She had thought Ethan's autism made him a pawn she could move around the board. She hadn't realized it had made him a grandmaster of the truth. The judge looked at the clock, then back at the two men sitting at the defense table. "The court has heard enough for today," she said, her voice unusually soft. "We will recess for lunch, and I will deliver my ruling this afternoon." As the gavel fell, David felt a strange sensation in his chest. The fear was gone. The weight he had carried since that rainy night 11 years ago had finally started to lift. He looked at Ethan, who was calmly shutting his laptop and placing it back in his bag. "You okay, buddy?" David whispered. Ethan looked at him and, for the first time in years, reached out and gave David's hand a firm, intentional squeeze. "The data is clean, Dad," he said. There's nothing left for her to say. The afternoon sun struggled to pierce through the thick Portland clouds. As David and Ethan returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The air no longer felt charged with the electricity of a fight, but rather heavy with the solemnity of a conclusion. Sienna sat at her table, but the poise was gone. She looked small, her expensive charcoal coat draped over her chair like a discarded skin. She didn't look at David, and she certainly didn't look at Ethan. She stared at the mahogany grain of the table, perhaps finally realizing that you cannot win a war of records when you have spent a decade leaving no trace of love. Judge Holloway didn't waste time. She stood behind her bench, her expression unreadable, but her voice carrying the finality of a closing door. She spoke about the law's respect for biology, but she spoke more about the law's duty to reality. She noted that guardianship is earned through the mundane, difficult, and consistent application of care, not through a sudden awakening sparked by financial gain. Her ruling was absolute. Sienna's petition for co-guardianship and control over the trust was denied. Furthermore, due to the evidence of long-term abandonment, David was granted full legal recognition as the primary guardian, and a permanent restraining order regarding Ethan's financial assets was put in place. The gavel hit the block with a sound that felt like the final brick being laid in a fortress. It was over. A week later, the world felt lighter. The legal fees were paid. The reporters, who had sniffed around the $3.7 million story, had moved on to the next scandal, and the house on the edge of the city felt like a home again. It was early Saturday morning, the time when Portland is at its quietest. David and Ethan walked along the banks of the Willamette River. The water was high from the spring rains, moving fast and dark, carrying bits of driftwood and fallen branches. Toward the Pacific. David carried 2 cups of coffee from their favorite local shop. He handed Ethan's to him, extra cream, no sugar, exactly the way it had been for 5 years. They found a bench near a bend in the river. where the sound of the water muffled the distant hum of the morning traffic. I keep thinking about that night, David said, looking out at the bridge, the night she left. I thought I had failed you because I couldn't make her stay. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes tracking the movement of a heron landing on a nearby pier. You didn't fail the system, Dad, he said. The system had a variable that didn't fit. You just kept the rest of the code running. David smiled, a genuine, deep-seated warmth spreading through his chest. I guess I did. But I learned something in that courtroom. I thought I was the one protecting you all these years. I thought I was the one holding the shield. But you were the one building the wall, brick by brick, record by record. Patterns provide safety. Ethan replied simply, but patterns require a constant. In my life, the only constant was you. Everything else changed: the houses, the schools, the doctors. You were the only part of the data that never deviated. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the river. David thought about the millions of dollars in the bank and the high-tech future Ethan had ahead of him. But then he looked at his own hands, the scars from the hospital pipes, the calluses from the wrench, and realized they were finally at rest. He didn't have to work the double shifts anymore. He didn't have to fear the knock on the door. He had stayed, and in the end, staying was the only thing that mattered. What's next, Ethan? David asked. Ethan stood up, adjusting his hoodie. I want to start a foundation, not for apps or software, for parents like you, the ones who stay in the room when it's too loud. I think they need better tools. David stood up with him, clapping a hand on his son's shoulder. They started walking back toward the car, to men who had survived a storm not by running from it, but by standing perfectly still until it passed. The river kept flowing, deep and steady, a long memory of a journey that was only just beginning. If you like history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.